From 1920 to 1933, Prohibition made it a federal crime to sell or consume alcohol in the U.S. The law was praised by Protestants who viewed the move as a moral victory. For devout Catholics and immigrants, it was an attack on their very way of life, creating a black market one family near Templeton used to defy lawmakers and survive during tough years on the farm. Elias Johnson shares their story in part one of Legendary Find.
Housed inside a small business in the heart of downtown Carroll,
the demand is overwhelming.
You'll find the world's most unlikely whiskey maker.
Honestly, if you'd have told me 2 days before I made this choice that I was going to be in the whiskey business, I'd have told you are out of your mind.
18 months ago, Heath Schneider was selling cars in Las Vegas, minding his own business, when he caught an article online referencing a very familiar name.
I run across a story about a guy making whiskey in Carroll, and he's mentioning my grandmother in his website, and he's spelling her name wrong. So we're like, well, at least he ought to get the spelling right.
A simple phone call to clear things up about his grandmother, Lorraine Sextro, turned into a conversation with Richard Eggers that changed the course of Heath's life.
She trained my brother, and my brother trained me, allegedly. The judge told me to use that word a lot, and I'm going to.
My grandmother made whiskey, and no one knew my grandmother made whiskey until late in her life. My grandmother started talking about making whiskey when she was like 90. And even when she was 90, she'd talk about making whiskey, and she'd look over her shoulder and tell you, I used to make whiskey.
It was a family secret Grandma Sextro kept under wraps for good reason. When she mastered the art of distilling rye grain whiskey, Prohibition outlawed any production or consumption of alcohol, and the family could lose everything if they were caught.
After World War I, money is tight, farm prices have collapsed, and you've got this national prohibition movement that Iowans who think that the idea of local control, consuming alcohol as a personal choice, see it as a way both to engage in something they believe is morally acceptable, but also a way to generate a little bit of income.
So you put your whiskey down in there and everything. Is that cool?
According to Heath, his grandfather, Frank Sextro, needed the money to stay on the farm so they could raise their 5 kids.
He was approached by an outfit making whiskey in the Carroll County area, asked if they could use his farm. They housed the bootlegger in their attic 6 days a week. My grandmother brought him lunch every day. He went home for church on Sundays. And in that time, she learned how to make whiskey from the bootlegger and started making her own little barn batch.
There was many Templeton rye recipes. There was a ton of them. There's probably 200-300 of them, but hers was 100% rye. This is the old school way. When you drink this is what you drank almost 100 years ago when you bought illegal whiskey in Iowa.
Now partners capable of producing 50,000 bottles of whiskey per month, Heath and Rich sit on over $1 million in inventory, aging patiently in these oak barrels.
And it all comes back to, a community that I grew up in. I'm from Denison, but Denison, Crawford County, Carroll County, it's all the same. And to go from that and then to move to Vegas for 30 years and be drawn back to Carroll County, 30 years later and get involved in a whiskey business, no way that could ever happen other than some version of what I would call divine intervention. It almost feels like a destiny to me at this point in time.
That's her story. That's her story right there.
That destiny took an unexpected turn when Lorraine and Frank Sextro's daughter, Shirley, shared one more family secret with her nephew, Heath.
When my dad was in the hospital reminiscing and talking about the good old days to my husband, and he was trying to convince Larry to go dig, there was whiskey buried. And Larry should go dig it up, and that would be good to dig that up.
Over a dozen barrels of rye whiskey buried to hide them on the Sextro family farm.
Feds raided the wrong farm east of them, and they could see it happening, and so they took them to Barney Sextro's place and buried them.
Now, I don't know what you know about whiskey that's 90 years old, especially 100% rye spirit from that era. but that is a true treasure hunt.
A treasure hunt for a piece of family history that to this point has been nothing short of a legend.
And I absolutely think there's whiskey out in those fields, and I'm so excited to find it because we're going to turn Carroll County into a place that people come like they go to Napa, but this will be the rye spirits experience, and we're hoping to be able to bring that to people when they come to Carroll County, Iowa.
Now, how does one go about finding something like buried whiskey barrels? As he found out, it's going to take time and money, two things you're going to need for a legendary find. In Carroll County, I'm Elias Johnson, Local 5 News. We are Iowa.
Make sure to tune in Thursday at 10 as Elias takes us to the location where Heath was told the barrels were hidden. The search is underway in part of 2 of Legendary Find.
Earlier this week, we took you to Carroll, Iowa, where distillers at Iowa Legendary Rye and continuing to make 100% rye whiskey from a recipe handed down by a bootlegging grandma during the height of Prohibition. But the story of Lorene Sextro making illegal whiskey wasn't the only family secret her grandson learned after recently getting into the family business. Here's Elias Johnson with part 2 of his series, Legendary Find.
Making whiskey from a 90-year-old recipe takes time.
These barrels, they take the time they need. You can't hurry it.
But it's not these barrels that have legendary rye maker Heath Schneider anxiously waiting.
We're going back in there, and hopefully we're going to find 90-year-old rye spirits, the only barrel of 90-year-old rye spirits in the world.
I went over what she had written and typed it.
After learning about his grandmother Lorene Sextro's notorious past bootlegging whiskey to save their family farm during the height of Prohibition, Heath's Aunt Shirley shared one more story as legendary as the spirit aging in their oak barrels.
My aunt was told by my grandfather on his deathbed that he had buried barrels out on great-grandpa Barney Sextro's farm, and he wanted us to dig them up.
According to the story passed down, the barrels were concealed near a creek not far from the farm as authorities closed in on the illegal operation.
She made, on their farm, it was about a mile out of Templeton, 300 gallons a day.
Richard Egger's brother was taught by Heath's grandmother how to distill her rye whiskey, a recipe passed down to him. When he learned about the buried whiskey barrels, the focus went from expansion of their product to recovering one of the originals.
I believe they're out there. Now, whether there's anything left in them, the good thing is American white oak doesn't decay underground. So if we find them, they'll still have fluid in them.
After researching the best way to go about finding something buried in the ground, the guys discovered man's best friend was a hunter's best option.
We're using the dogs to attempt to locate volatile organic compounds that might be emitting from buried whiskey barrels.
Jim Peters has spent weeks making sure his dogs know exactly what they're looking for.
This is one of Iowa Legendary's barrels chopped up into training targets.
Okay, Jojo, let's go get some whiskey.
With a scent to go on, the dogs waste little time tracking down several potential sites along the field.
Yes, there it is. Good girl. There's something there that she's really interested in. Don't know till we dig.
They would have buried the barrels in the dead of night somewhere by this creek. To the north of the creek is what we've heard.
But before the shovels can come out, Megan Stromestrel, an archaeologist from Cherokee, checks each site with a device called a gradiometer. Making sure what lies beneath is something they'd actually want to dig up.
If we had started digging up on the hill without doing the gradiometer and just by the dog alerts, we might have stumbled across human remains, which is something we definitely don't want to do. We want to leave those undisturbed.
Native American burial sites are not uncommon in rural Iowa and are rarely ever marked. With one site determined to likely be that of human remains, the focus is on other potential targets, an in-depth process that takes time and money Heath is banking will pay off.
I'm betting real hard cash on it. I've spent money to go after it. I've paid the teams. I've put my own time into it. I fly back here and personally and party to it. And I absolutely think there's whiskey out in those fields.
If the team finds rye whiskey preserved inside the barrels, it would be worth millions. But even remnants of the fluid would hold value historically using modern science.
I would love to take that spirit extract the yeast from 1930, and take that last piece of the puzzle in our recipe and use that yeast from 1930 that my grandma used to make our whiskey.
We've contacted some people that if we find the barrels with fluid in it, they can reproduce the yeast that she used, even though I'm making it per her handwriting, but we can make it exact. So everything will be exactly as she made it in 1931.
So that would be like nothing anyone's done.
So right over where Jim is, there was a spike. So we're going to see if it's just a little bit of farm metal left behind, or maybe it's part of the barrels.
With the site mapped and registered with the state of Iowa, the only thing left is to wait for these crops to come out so Heath can hopefully harvest a piece of family history.
Every time I'm out in the field and the dog's alert and the archaeologist calls me with a site that we've got to register, the hair on the back of my neck stands up and I'm like, when can we dig? You know, when can we dig? Thank God the land's still, it's in my family. It's still a Sextro-owned property, and I've gotten permission from my family to be out there. So all the stars and planets have aligned, and I feel like that's going to lead me to a barrel, and every time I think about it, I get chills.
Luckily, these barrels have taught Rich and Heath and all the guys at the distillery a thing or two on how to be patient. So what did the dogs find in the ground? Is it the legendary find they're hoping for, or just some scrap metal that somebody had forgotten about long ago? We'll just have to wait and see. In Carroll County, I'm Elias Johnson, Local 5 News. We are Iowa.
Now, since 2015, whiskey makers with Iowa legendary rye have been perfecting a recipe passed down by an unlikely grandma bootlegger outside Templeton. The Sextro family got into the business during Prohibition as a way to save their family. But a year ago, the story got very interesting after one of the family members shared one more secret.
Yeah, more than a dozen barrels may have been buried along with other remnants of the illegal operation, sending the current owners of the distillery on a true treasure hunt. Elias Johnson takes us back to Carroll County for the legendary dig.
Months of mapping and marking.
Actually, I'm going to change that spot.
Searching and barking.
Okay, let's get some whiskey. Let's go.
Waiting for the chance.
Like, when can we dig? You know, when can we dig?
To bring a piece of family history.
All right, good girl. Let's go.
Back to life.
We're going back in there, and hopefully we're going to find 90-year-old rye spirits, the only barrel of 90-year-old rye spirits in the world.
For the last year, Heath Schneider and Rich Eggers have been chasing a legend.
My aunt was told by my grandfather on his deathbed that he had buried barrels out on great-grandpa Barney Sextro's farm, and he wanted us to dig them up.
The initial search for the barrels centered around a creek where an old farmstead belonging to a member of the Sextro family once stood.
These people were not criminals. These people were damn good people, and they did it to pay for their farms and to feed their kids. They give you the shirt off their back.
After a week poking around potential sites, the search has brought the team back to the family farm. Lorraine Sextro bootlegged her famous rye whiskey, where remnants from the 20s and 30s is still visible on this wall of a corn crib from heat emitted during the process she perfected. After the Sextro family was nearly caught by the feds, the decision was made to bury all evidence of the illegal operation that at its peak produced up to 300 gallons a day.
They buried everything, and there's a good reason. They didn't want to go to jail, but now it's time to dig it up.
Ground sonar showed this spot next to the corn crib, registering metal beneath the surface.
Oh.
Just inches down, the guys find what's showing up on metal detectors.
I don't think that's tile. No, that's the way it came.
It's rounded almost.
Oh, this is unbelievable. This is definitely something that Lorraine and Frank Sextro put here.
Peeling back each layer by hand, the large metal object sees the sun for the first time in nearly 90 years.
Well, I gotta tell you, it's sure starting to look more like a still. Yeah, look at all the rivets on that. That thing was made to hold pressure.
Only the last person to touch this was my grandfather and his brothers.
Other items pulled from the ground start to back up Rich's gut feeling.
Look, I wonder what that is.
Next to what could be one of several iron whiskey stills used by Loren, pieces of what appear to be wood.
It could be the pieces of an old whiskey barrel. Oh man, that's awesome.
That's a good find.
We may have one hell of a find here, I'm telling you.
And further down,
Wow.
something the team has been hoping to find.
What's that?
An intact bottle with fluid inside.
I would love to take that spirit, extract the yeast from 1930, and take that last piece of the puzzle in our recipe and use that yeast from 1930 that my grandma used to make our whiskey.
And other bottles recovered have date stamps, further indicating when everything was buried.
1929.
Hoping to beat the early arrival of freezing temperatures, Alan Malbauer, who now owns the old Sextro farm, tries his best to free the large metal object.
We just got to get it out of the ground.
But on this day, the tomb possibly holding Lorraine's rye whiskey lab isn't ready to simply hand over its contents, which could contain much more than the team uncovered today.
But we got a drone that can see 8 feet in the ground. We're going to do the whole acreage.
That is a true treasure hunt.
Time to bring her back, and we're already doing a recipe, so I think she's looking down smiling right now.
Outside Templeton in Carroll County, Elias Johnson, Local 5 News.
Yeah, look at this thing.
We are Iowa.
And just yesterday, the guys pulled the object from the ground and have confirmed it is one of the old whiskey stills. They're now testing the liquid found inside that bottle and others and the wood to see exactly what they have found. We'll keep you posted as the legendary find continues.